Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and I'm with Audrey Waters. Hi, Audrey.
Hello.
It's the 14th of April, 2012, and this is the Hack Education Week in Review. Audrey, very interesting week.
This was
Um,
this was an interesting week, and sort of in terms of the stories I wrote, I would say less news heavy, but lots of sort of doing a lot of thinking, more thoughtful and maybe not thoughtful. That's not the right word. More analysis, less
Deep
news.
thinking week.
Yes, yes,
So, this one laptop per child
yeah.
story is fascinating to me. 25 million laptops later, a study of the results in Peru showing no increase in math and language scores. I'm tempted to want to kind of push back. On the other hand, feel the need to leave myself open to an understanding that it may not actually be very successful. What's the real
Right.
story?
Well, I mean, I was actually really mortified to see The Economist was the first publication that sort of framed the news in this way about the study out of Peru that reviewed the implementation of the one laptop per child notebooks there, and their conclusion was several things, but their main conclusion was that the laptops didn't increase test scores. And now I think and then of course that was picked up by the tech blogs who just love that sort of story, and I think it's really important to recognize that that was never the intention of of the one laptop per child project, and in fact the study in Peru found that there was some increase in cognitive skills, and that to me that's more along the lines of what Laptop per Child promised to do, which was to sort of help students sort of learn to learn, which is a very different thing than we're going to make sure that your math PISA scores improve. And so I do think that it's grossly unfair. While I do think it's unfair to charge the project as a failure, I think it's also important to recognize that the One Laptop per Child initiative does have some deep flaws. And even if we're not judging it based on standardized achievement, we do still need to look critically about what we want from the project and what exactly the outcomes have been.
I left my thinking of this story led me very much toward kind of the question of complexity of technology versus results and outcome. And I kept thinking about cell phones and reading devices and how significantly simpler devices seem to be having a much greater impact. Is that fair?
I think no. I think that I mean. I think that that's partially what I would push back on with the whole initiative. I mean, after all, despite the promise of Nicholas Negroponte, who commented on my blog, that was a triumph of the week. The despite and didn't like my story, but whatever. Despite his promise of these would be $100 devices, the prices never got down that low, and so we've seen a massive adoption of other kinds of devices. Now they aren't the same. Certainly the functionality isn't the same. You can't do the same on a flip phone that you can on a Linux box, but I do think that we're seeing different technology coming to play, and I think that the World Reader project, which we've talked about a lot, bringing Kindles into villages in Africa, is certainly a good indication of the ways in which we can do the literacy component without a $200 machine.
There's another element to this which maybe goes a little bit deeper, and that's just the whole question of what's the progression of learning devices and their application. And it feels very much like, and say in the case of the cell phone or the electronic reader, that you're sort of learning as you go along how the learning device is having an impact. Whereas the one laptop per child really followed the model of design in advance and kind of push down, which feels
Mm-hmm.
almost the opposite of sort of the world of the web right now, in which there's this constant iteration and shifting and understanding of kind of how solutions evolve based on the crowd's response. And it was interesting to me because I've been such a fan of the project to look at it from that aspect and say, I'm not sure I feel like that was the right approach.
I think that that's one of the things that I would say, much like you, someone I'm a huge proponent of the idea of the initiative. I do think it's important to get technology in the hands of every single person, to have them have computing power, to have them have a communication device like this. But I think you're right. I mean, I think that the speed and caution perhaps with which these devices have been designed is just moving at a far different pace than than other technologies that haven't been constrained by some of these other factors. Although, interestingly enough, of course, we also saw Intel release a device this week, too. That there is other interest, and people are building these, low cost, highly durable tablets. It's not as though the device is sort of a, a, not interesting to anybody. I mean, I think there is still interest in it, but I think that it has moved at a pace that doesn't quite seem right to particularly cell phone adoption in the developing world.
Yeah, it is very interesting that the story, the counterpoint to the story is everybody else creating other devices. This device is a failure, but we're creating all of these other devices. And for me, sort of fascinatingly, the question of where does the complexity come in? Is it in the advanced design, or is it in sort of understanding the learning and the social aspects that are taking place, and then designing around it? Maybe it's not a coincidence that I did get to download Instagram this last week as an Android user, and am kind of stunned at the simplicity of the actual experience
Mm-hmm.
and how compelling it is, and that you don't need to have necessarily front loaded complexity to have a really interesting learning experience.
I think that's interesting. And I'd forgotten that the Facebook Instagram news of this week too. But I think that that's one of the interesting things about Instagram as well, is that the social component really grew. The social network that grew around Instagram was was also this a distinct social network than the ones that are sort of have been created around something like Facebook, and sort of forced created social networks. This was, I mean, the Instagram one feels like a very different kind of network of people.
Yeah, we're descending here into fascinating territory. But my kids have all loaded this drawing program. I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking it's called Draw Now.
Uh-huh. Is that the game?
It's the game, and
Yeah.
it's incredibly simple. But again, it highlights the value of the social connections. And we're not talking about any kind of deep learning here, but we are talking about engagement, interest, and connecting with people. We'll probably end up following up on that. So speaking of complexity, the Department of Ed releases a draft report called Enhancing Teaching Through Educational Data Mining.
Yes.
Uh, is what Netflix does data mining, and wait, data analytics.
Mm-hmm.
Was what Netflix does data mining, and are there lessons to be learned from comparing these two ideas?
Well, one of the things that I think is important to recognize is that I think data mining has a really pejorative connotation. I think that when we think about data mining, we there's this knee-jerk reaction almost among consumers that this is something that's invading your privacy, and that people are sort of pouring through your personal records and looking for sort of things that you don't know and that you don't want other people to know about. And data mining is really the process of taking massive amounts of data, finding particularly of unstructured data. So this is data that lives in a different sort of format than, say, tables and columns in an Excel spreadsheet. So this is it's a matter of going through unstructured data and finding patterns. And this is how all sorts of algorithms that we use all the time on the internet have been created. It's how the idea of data mining and machine learning underwrites a lot of what happens. It's how Netflix knows to recommend us movies. It's how Amazon knows to recommend us books. And so there are useful things that come from our data being analyzed that way. And I think that the Department of Education is clearly, I mean, and this is something I've noticed for a long time now, but the Department of Education is clearly sort of easing folks into this conversation. The educational data, data mining, and learning analytics are going to be a big trend. They're a trend elsewhere in business elsewhere, but they're going to be a big trend in the future in education. And I think that this first white paper was sort of an introduction to the concept and a way to sort of get people thinking about it and perhaps getting over that knee-jerk reaction to the term data mining. Oops, did I lose you?
You did, but I'm back. I heard knee-jerk reaction.
Well, there was a well, that's yeah, the knee-jerk reaction to data mining is I think what the Department of Education is trying to counter. Are you there?
So the pejorative again. Can you hear me, Audrey?
Oh yeah, I can hear you now. Oh, lovely Skype. When are we going to deal with that?
No. You can still hear me, and I'll keep talking.
Okay, I can hear you. It seems like
Okay.
there's a little delay,
So,
but it's fine now.
yeah, it does sound like there's a little delay. So the pejorative aspects of data mining for me tend to fall into the category of somebody using data to develop ideas around things that may not actually reflect reality, that it's data that's used without sort of conscious control or understand clarity or transparency. So, part of what I like about Netflix and part of what I like about other kinds of services like Amazon that provide that is that it's very much done in conjunction with the user. It enhances my personal agency to have the data mining. Is that coming out in the Department of Ed material?
Yeah, I would say no. I mean, and that would be my pushback on all of this. And I think that it's one of the ways in which the educational data is this other layer of complexity, right? Because it is, this isn't just about how a school performs or how a teacher performs or what's happening in a classroom. That this is each individual learner, and although you do sign a terms of service agreement when you use Netflix, and you do. Well, you may not read it, but there is a recognition that this is happening. We don't actually hand over those terms of service agreements to each individual student and their parents in order to get permission about sort of the ways in which their data is being utilized. So I do think it's an interesting time to sort of think about who owns the data, who controls the data, because it's not the student. And in fact, one of the concerns I think we should have too is that it's actually not the schools. This data actually resides more often than not in third-party vendors' software, and so the schools don't even own the data. All of this data that we're tracking on, whether it's sort of the school information system or the learning management system, that's elsewhere. That's the schools. I mean, it's not even necessarily under the school's full control.
So when Amazon or Netflix use that data, I feel like ultimately because it's intriguingly a customer-based model, it's used to help me make a better decision. And I've maybe I'm drawing too close a parallel, but when we talk about the gamification of education, I really love the idea of looking at what games do to enhance our own engagement, but I don't like the idea of tricking people into learning. I love the idea of data being able to help us make better decisions for ourselves, but I don't love the idea of somebody making policy decisions on data that don't really involve the individual. Is that too stark a contrast?
I don't think it is, and I think that, I mean, again, I think it's something that we need to be thinking about as we move forward into these discussions. Because I think one of the interesting movements that I've seen come up is what's called the quantifiable self movement, and that's people tracking all sorts of data from their own personal lives. Often, it's associated with people that have health problems, or are interested in dieting. So they'll track, you'll track your calories. You'll have a machine that tracks your movement, how many steps you've taken during the course of the day, and or track sort of what you've eaten, what you've done, what you've read, how many emails you've responded to. It can be pretty interesting. People tracking sort of the different transactions in their day and being able to make sense of their own personal data. And I think that has some really interesting potentials for learning. If learners could create their own dashboards and track for themselves, track track what they've read, track how far they've gotten in certain books, tracks what they're doing in their day in terms of physical and mental activity. That's really interesting, and I think you could have some interesting insights there. But again, I think what we're looking at in terms of often in terms of data mining and learning analytics, at least in its current, partially because of the data that currently the education system cares about, is really going to be a focus more on, I think, on standardized testing. I think that's my big fear, is that when we talk about data, we're actually talking about standardized testing.
Interesting. It's no coincidence that I've downloaded the audio version of 1984 this week. I'm thinking a lot about sort of data and how we end up using it.
Hmm.
You use the phrase data curious,
Yeah.
not data driven. Why?
Well, I think that data driven, partially I think that data driven is this buzzword that gives me pause, because I don't think we know a lot of we don't know enough yet. I mean, despite all of these tools at our disposal, despite all of the data at our disposal, we really don't know enough about learning to be able to actually make decisions based around it. I mean, my fear is when we talk, again, my fear is that these conversations tend to focus on standardized testing, because that seems to be sort of the low-hanging fruit of the data that we're using, and that we've already accepted the arguments that somehow that's a way to track learning. And so I'm nervous about data driven, because I don't think we know enough yet. But I am curious. I mean, I do think that there are probably really interesting things really interesting insights that we can uncover, particularly when some of these systems that don't talk to each other start to talk to each other, right? When we're able to sort of overlay patterns from the different databases that educational data lives in, and look at it all together. I think that there might be things that we hadn't recognized before. There might be ways that we can confirm the suspicions that we already have as well.
Well, this obviously segues us right into the My Data button
Hmm.
conversation. And the core question for me would be, when you focus on one aspect of valuation, and let's say that data in this case, do you end up seeing everything through that valuation or that lens? And while this feels to me like it would be really valuable, to what degree does it create myopia for us? How much do we want it, and how much do we want to be careful about it?
Well, again, I think that some of this comes from what we're thinking about in terms of data, because I'm really fascinated by a project it's called the Locker Project, and it's this, and I would hope, under the best possible circumstances, that what the Department of Education will help build is a personal data locker for every single student in the country. And so that's not just a matter of downloading your official transcript. Although I think you should be able to download your official transcript. It's not just your financial aid record, although I think you should be able to download that and control that information too. It's thinking about how are you able to extract all of your personal data that lives across all of these systems on the web, what Facebook knows about you, what all of your tweets, all of your Instagram photos, all of your Flickr photos, all of your Google Docs, those all of I mean, if I think about my own personal digital data footprint and record, it's scattered across all of these different systems, some of which allow me to export, some of which don't. And I wish there were, I think that there's a number of ways in thinking about how are you able to back up your life sort of into your own personal data locker, and then from there control who has access to it. And again, this connects to the story I wrote about APIs, but if I could have an API for Audrey and then I could control who gets access to my data, I would really, if I had to sort of verify who could mine my data, I would love to have more control over my data that way.
Interesting. A little bit of a dilemma because in order to enact that, we would have to create a system of higher level control rather than sort of the entrepreneurial independent model which exists now.
That's the interesting I mean, I think that that's the interesting piece about it too. Is when I was talking to the Department of Ed this week about some of these data initiatives, it's a good reminder that they, in terms of data at least, they know very little about students, or under the umbrella of their department. There's the data that they are responsible for is actually quite small. And again, that comes back to this question that this data is already being controlled by third party companies. I mean, the Pearsons, the Blackboards of the world. That's where the data is.
I want to leave this story just with the caveat that of my children's educational experiences each year, the data is not really the measure. And that's why I'm interested in this. I mean, this is a deep and interesting story, and it relates to all of the sort of questions about control and the like. But it feels like to me the danger is that we are thinking too much about things that can be represented numerically and not about the actual learning.
Oh, I don't think data is numeric. I mean, I would say that my blog posts are data, right? I mean, that's my data. I'm not talking about sort of grades and attendance information. I mean, and I think that that's part of the worry is that that's what we're going to go for. But I think that our data contains other things as well. This is, these are the paintings that we make in school. These are the essays that we write for class. I mean, there's all sorts of data that's not just a number.
Yeah. I'm curious that I'm even with that, I still feel as though the engagement of her English class this year stunningly overwhelms and outweighs any of the numerical or even non-numerical artifacts of that learning.
Yeah.
So I'll have to think about that. But I'm interested in watching the services right now that seem to be doing a good job of sort of independently saying you're likely to be using the following 10 or 12 or 15 services. We'll pull that data in for you and aggregate it together, where it's almost like an entrepreneurial solution.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that this really is going to be an interesting area to watch, and my hope really is that it starts making us have some conversations about student control of and student ownership of this material, and I think because I think that actually you can't have that conversation without having a conversation about student control of their learning. Hopefully.
Good for you. Okay, tell me about the official announcement of Facebook groups for EDU. What's going on here?
Well, so Facebook started, of course, as at a number of colleges, at Harvard at first, and then spread throughout through the Ivy League, and was that initial manifestation of Facebook was you needed to have a university email address in order to get access, and you were sort of automatically placed in a group based on your university. and before they opened it up to high school students and then eventually to the general public. And this week, Facebook, many people said, "Oh, Facebook is returning to its roots. It's testing some university-only groups that if you sign up for, you're plopped into a special group just related to your campus. You can create subgroups, you can have special events, and you can also do some file sharing among other students that have the same that share your university email address." It was one of the, I mean, I think it's on one hand it's not that interesting a story to me. I think that I think that Facebook has become such a behemoth that I have to wonder when they make a move like this, sort of what their rationale is. And of course, there are several startups that are working to use the Facebook platform to build out other ways for university students to communicate with one another, and also to think about recruitment and study groups and the like. So is this a case of Facebook sort of poaching other startups' ideas, or is this sort of just Facebook scrambling to do something that looks innovative? I'm not sure, but I had lots of questions, particularly related to this notion of file sharing, which is, I think, the bane of many campuses that have found themselves legally responsible for some of the file sharing that happens on campus. So it's interesting to think about Facebook sort of sanctioning file sharing, which is something that I don't think is necessarily piracy, but again, it has this connotation of file sharing when you're file sharing, you're sort of doing a Napster, you're sharing music illegally.
It is kind of this odd moment when the countercultural movement becomes sort of uh, deeply addressing sort of traditional
Mm-hmm.
kinds of questions. And I mean, you studied this much more than I did, but I was kind of struck by the idea that in some ways this felt like a defensive move.
Yeah, and it's I think that Integral is a good example of a startup that's been working on this for a long time. But I think this comes back to our previous question too. I mean, I think that one of the things that I think we have to recognize when we use these third-party systems to conduct our school's business is that there are huge questions about data ownership. So if your school or if your class is using a tool like Facebook or a tool like Edmodo, or that your data that the students' data is like, how are you going to be able to get the data out of there?
Richard Stallman becomes relevant again.
Very relevant.
Okay, so crowdfunding's next frontier, academic research? Question mark. This really excited me.
This is a great story. I met the founder, Denny, last year in Seattle at a startup weekend, and it was by far my favorite idea that I saw pitched that weekend. And he's been working on it for a long time, and because I think that there are a lot of challenges to take on this sort of institutional way that research is funded, and sort of legal questions and just sort of these institutional barriers to entry. But he finally launched his startup this week, and I am really excited and really intrigued at the notion of taking this crowdfunding model, right, which is where you turn it over to the community and you at large, and you ask the community to make sort of small donations to support projects. And if those projects get enough momentum behind them, then the applicant gets the money and moves on. So, and what he's built is, I think, a little bit different than Kickstarter too. And Kickstarter is usually the sort of example that's given, insofar as that he's not requiring people offer prizes to those who support the research. Instead, he's asking that the researchers open their research process along the way, and share share updates with the people who've backed their projects, so that it becomes almost, I mean, it's sort of open. I mean, I guess it is opening sort of the doors of the lab, so that people have insights into the state, the research, the questions and the practices along the way, which I think is really interesting.
It feels like we're going to have to resolve some real issues here around investments and return and the like. But even in the meantime, for somebody who has an autoimmune disorder that doesn't really get funded because there's no high profit vision,
Hmm.
it seems like all of a sudden we could open ourselves up to the funding around things like holistic medicine or, you know, things that traditional companies aren't going to get compensated for, but that actually really need to be studied.
I think that that's a really interesting thing that I was asking Denny about this too, is that, he said that he was really interested in sort of making, helping demonstrate the sort of some of the really fascinating process of sort of doing science and doing research and what it actually looks like. And I asked him sort of, when you open that up to a community of scholars, so if it's just sort of scientists that are interested in this, in mycorrhiza, that's the name of the startup, then what will they support? But if you open it up to the community at large, what sort of science does does the public, the general public, want to see done? And I think that that raises some interesting questions about what would we support as a country if it was up to us to decide what sort of research was done, what would get supported, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, I think it could have some positive and negative repercussions.
I can certainly see some positive ones right off the bat. The kinds of places where large financing lobbies have
Yes.
directed us towards certain kinds of beliefs about health, where you would say we probably recognize that these aren't necessarily true, but the money has really driven the thinking.
Hmm.
You'll have to keep us informed on the negatives. Okay, so the feel-good story of the week for me was this Kane's Arcade.
Yes, I loved this.
Oh my gosh, what a delightful little movie.
Well, to me, that this is one of those, it was so funny as I spent so much time this week thinking about the technology and thinking about the data, and I think it's so easy to get sort of lost in what learning should look like, and what really matters in terms of finding a child's passion and supporting their curiosity and helping them do so. And if for folks who haven't watched this Kane's Arcade video, it's wonderful. Kane made a cardboard arcade, and a filmmaker managed to get a flash mob to come and support him, and it's really delightful.
The story existed for me on two levels. One was the sort of uniquely enjoyable view of this boy building a cardboard arcade, almost like a Brazilian slum city out of, multiple tiers of activities, but also the power of an adult to recognize that.
Yes. Yes, I mean, and the adult in terms of, I would say that there are several adults. There's a father who I think, is who has an auto parts store that sort of has just turned over the storefront to Kane, recognizing that most of his business has moved online. So Kane gets this space, this physical space to sort of build his dream. But then also the filmmaker who stumbles upon this idea and then doesn't just he buys a fun pass, right? But then he also recognizes how can we as a community support what Kane is doing.
So, what's the balance between that kind of entrepreneurial, agency driven, passion driven education and sort of the sciences where you recognize that there's years of kind of traditional learning that have to take place to cover the historical content that's so valuable to making progress? How do the two mix together?
That's a really interesting question. Are you talking about in terms of Kane's own learning, or just in terms of how we think about learning?
How we think about learning, and Keynes would be reflective of that, which is that what he's done is highly entrepreneurial, individualized, and valuable. And how does that mesh with the kind of deep learning that would need to take place if he decided to become a physicist.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so I think, I mean, what's interesting is I think that you can see the you can sort of see some of the seeds of that practice already in what he's doing. You can sort of see the way in which he engineered the he put the calculators on the side of each box with the safety mechanism, which is this which is I think a recognition that credit cards have, that there's that credit cards have a safety mechanism, that the numbers in a credit card are algorithmically indicate whether or not it's a real credit card or not, even before you've run the card. And so I think that you can see seeds of the things that he's already seen from his own life, right? The experiences that he's had, and he's using that knowledge to sort of build this groundwork. How it gets to the next step, I think, is partially, his decision to sort of build a better claw machine, for example. I think that if his passions are supported, he probably will move from the fishing hook to a claw device in order to make a better tool.
Well, and certainly for me, I left the video with a remembrance or a reminder of the diversity of ways in which we learn and engage in life and the variety of paths available. And so maybe it was a unique take on the film, but I left kind of being reminded that not everything has to happen in the same way for every child.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that's really important. I mean, and because I think that one of the things that it seemed to me as though Kane's experience was very much grounded in all sorts of things that he would have known from his own personal experience too. So he's building on what he knows authentically, just by being around his dad, by being around his dad's shop, sort of what he knows already and what he's interested and passionate about already, and that's going to take him on a different direction than just sort of imposing, if you will, sort of a physics curriculum on designing objects.
And that $1 million smile.
Yes.
You just love him. Okay, so the Department of Justice files a lawsuit charging Apple and 5 of the world's largest publishers that they've colluded to fix the price of ebooks. How does this play into the stories that we've been talking about? And if the big winner isn't us, who is the big winner?
It's been very interesting to watch the publishers and the Department of Justice respond here. But what they're responding to or what the Department of Justice is charging, is that Apple and 5 of the biggest publishers, so that's Hachette, Simon and Schuster, and I always feel compelled to say who actually owns these companies, because sometimes it's important to recognize sort of the corporate control here. So Simon and Schuster, which is owned by CBS, right? HarperCollins, which is owned by News Corp. Penguin, which is of course owned by my good friends at Pearson. Macmillan. So those 5 publishers were charged with colluding with Apple to fix the pricing of ebooks and what's called the agency price model, which the pricing has been set at $9.99, and it means that retailers are not able to offer ebooks at a discount. So you're not able to have a sale, for example, on Dan Brown ebooks and sell them, 1 week only. We're going to sell Dan Brown ebooks for $4.99. They, according to the Department of Justice, they colluded to keep the prices fixed and the prices high. So I think that this raises all sorts of interesting questions about this move, the move to digital, the move to digital content, in which we're seeing some of these established companies really scramble to sort of rethink how their business will operate. And I think that there are other pieces of the puzzle that the Department of Justice overlooked in their concern over price. For example, none of them tackled this notion of DRM, right, which is the technology that stops you from being able to share your ebooks or move your ebooks from one device or format to another. And I think that it's pretty clear that the big winner here is Amazon, because Amazon, of course, is the largest bookseller in the world, and has the volume that it could sell Dan Brown's novels at, you know, 99 cents, take a loss and still sort of be all right. And so I think that that's, I think that Amazon really will come out the winner here. What that means in terms of, you know, in terms of publishing and in terms of the publishing industry, I'm not sure because I'm not really sure sort of how much of the publishing is going to move to self-publishing, and I don't know how much Amazon will be able to support that. Certainly, certainly better than Apple.
Virginia becomes the latest state to require high school students to take at least one online class in order to graduate. Is there any deeper thinking here than there was in Idaho?
Well, I think I think that the questions are still the questions are the same as they were in Idaho. Is this going to be a great thing for students who are going to have some choice? Students who will be able to, for example, take AP Computer Science if their own school doesn't offer it, right? If they could sort of take an online class, that's a great thing for students who don't have opportunities at their school. Or is this something that is really just going to funnel public money into some of these private or for-profit companies that tend to run massive online schools? I mean, will local high schools and schools in Virginia run the online component, or is this going to be farmed out to other companies?
Is there a money trail?
I haven't looked closely enough to know if there is a money trail, but this is politics, so I'm not afraid to go on record and say probably.
There's always a money trail. I'm imagining that Cable Green is standing up and cheering for the World Bank announcement
Yes,
on open access.
this is important. I mean, this is really important. I think we're starting to see more and more um, um, of governmental organizations, more agencies, more recognize the importance of open access, the importance of what it means when your organization does research and has massive amounts of data. How can we license that as openly as possible? And the World Bank announced this week that all of their data, all of their knowledge outputs, all of their research will be openly licensed, or with the CC BY Creative Commons license.
Um, a federal appeals court revives the Rosetta Stone lawsuit against Google. I have to admit a pet peeve here. Trademark law is intended to protect the consumer, and yet it feels like it's often used as leverage for increasing profitability of existing companies. Is there more to this story? It really bothers me, this idea that companies use trademark lawsuits to put little guys out of business.
Well, the Google, the little guy in this case is I mean
Right.
is Google.
That's a little guy.
But I think and I should note here that this story makes me chuckle because I actually went to high school with the CEO of Rosetta Stone, and so it's funny to think about the Rosetta Stone's attitude towards web technology and mine. Not to place all of that on to when I went to high school with, but I think that what we're seeing here is a is one of these companies that was, in some ways, a pre-web company that was phenomenally successful at selling boxed software. How they're struggling to make the transition to to a world where the content is sort of distributed digitally and distributed on the web. And Rosetta Stone is nowhere near as valuable a company, as profitable a company as it was a decade ago. And it looks like they're blaming Google rather than blaming, the model of having kiosks in airports and selling box software.
Well, the little guy obviously isn't Google. The little
Right.
guy is the startup online language program
Right, and
that's
who
being told
probably, yeah, who's
they can't
probably
use the words Rosetta Stone.
exactly. I mean, and I think that that's can't buy Rosetta Stone keywords in order to when you search when you make a search for language learning software that you and when you make a search for Rosetta Stone that more than just Rosetta Stone Rosetta Stone software comes up on the Google Ads. We're talking about the Google Ads on the side.
Well, this has bothered me for years because it's the idea that if somebody sells uh, Ford compatible car parts,
Mm-hmm.
that they couldn't use the word Ford. They couldn't buy a search keyword for that. So if somebody was actually looking for Ford parts, they would only get authorized Ford company
Right.
responses. And this has bothered me, and it's bothered me as well with the whole Moodle thing, because Moodle sent out cease and desist letters saying you can't use the word Moodle to advertise that you're doing Moodle training. Well, of course you can, because the trademark law says that you can use the name of a company. You just have to make sure that the consumer isn't confused as to who the players actually are. But the purpose of the trademark law is to protect the consumer and not the company. So this really stuck with me for some reason.
Yeah. No, I think it's going to be an interesting case to watch, in part because there are a number of these cases going on right now against Google that are challenging the way in which the Google works in terms of its ads, but also in terms of search. And I think that what happens when we have a new technology who organizes the Google's search algorithm that organizes information in a certain way, and when that particular organization of information threatens other interests because they had benefited from that older version of information. And so I think it's thinking about does the law how does the law intervene here when the technology has clearly moved much faster.
Chris Dawson claims that the new Intel study book is what an education tablet should be. Why?
He liked the size. He liked the durability. He liked the option that it comes with Android, with an Android or a Windows operating system. I'm not. I mean, and he liked the price too, which is expected to be around $200. I'm not sure. And I should add too. He also really likes the Intel's other similar device, their Classmates netbook, which I've played with the Classmates netbook, but I haven't had a chance to see the new tablet yet. I mean, I'm I'm not sure. I think that I'm still sort of waiting for a solid Android tablet to come out for schools to adopt. Has Intel nailed it with this one? I don't know. There are a lot of things on the Classmates PC that I really do like. I like the durability. I like the fact that they're definitely designed to have elementary school students being able to sort of knock them off the desk and they'll still survive. But is that sort of hardware durability, sort of, is that sort of sufficient to have a win here, particularly a win against iPad? I'm not sure.
Well, the irony for me is that the iPad is not in any way kind of configured or created as an educational device.
Mm-hmm.
So why would its competitor or a competitor that would want to be successful be created as an educational device?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, it's interesting because clearly, companies like Intel are seeing this massive interest in adopting tablets that for reasons again that I'm not fully sure of what the rationale is. Many educators have decided that tablets are the way to go, and so as Apple is that leading there, we're seeing a lot of these other devices sort of working. Other companies work to create a better educational tablet. And I'm still not convinced that the tablet is the ideal piece of hardware to give every student.
I love my tablet. I love my mobile phone. I'm one guy with a headset sitting on a computer who's not, at one of these big companies. But my advice would be, if you really want to create another device that will be valuable, look at the fact that Apple's created a consumer device that people are bringing themselves into schools.
Right.
Okay, Open Badges has its official beta launch. Mozilla's Open Badges infrastructure.
Yep. I haven't dug too deeply into what this looks like now. I will add this. I'm currently mentoring a P2PU challenge on writing for the web, and we've been debating about whether or not we should do, offer a badge for those folks who are participating. And I must say, sort of, when it comes to thinking about how do you handle assessment, and how do you reward or not reward badges? It's really been challenging for me to think about, despite my, I would say, despite sort of my interest in Mozilla's badging process. Once the sort of rubber hits the road and it's time to sort of develop an assessment around an informal learning experience, it has really been challenging for me to think about, do I want badges on my P2PU class? And if I do, what do those look like?
Common Sense Media releases a rating system for parents, teachers, and kids to make smart decisions about the learning potential for digital media. Good thing?
I think that it. I mean, I think that the Common Sense Media. I think that this is a good thing. I think that there is. I mean, this is something that I've talked about a lot. There's this glut of products that are being released, particularly apps, but also websites, video games, and the like, that purport to be educational, right? That purport to be, or I would say that are aimed at children, some of which purport to be educational. And what it's very hard for parents, particularly when it requires, spending money on an app, to sort of know what's really worth it and what's not. And the rating system that currently exists in Apple's App Store, or in the Chrome, in the Android store, that's not always a good way to gauge if something's educational, or something, if it's level appropriate. So this is a good move. I think that Common Sense Media is sort of a trusted source to do this too.
Grade Guru is being shut down, and yet 25% of college students say they use a site like Grade Guru. Why is it being shut down?
Well, this is interesting news in light again of the Facebook groups. So McGraw-Hill actually runs Grade Guru. They said that they're just not. They said that their direction lies elsewhere, which, I mean, I think could be just marketing code for, we weren't we weren't making any money. I'm not sure, but McGraw-Hill has said that they're no longer interested in supporting this, which is too bad, because I think that some of these social studying sites have really taken off, and I think students are working together online. And so, as Grade Guru closes, will students move back to Facebook? I mean, perhaps that's partly what explains Facebook's interest in reconstituting university level groups.
Did they have much of market share, Grade Guru?
I'm not sure what their market share was. I mean, and there are quite a few other startups and other companies that are doing this.
So it could just be that they didn't feel they were doing it well enough to keep doing it.
Right.
In the shocking story of the week, 38% of kids on Facebook are reported to be under the age of 12. Of course, this comes from a company that has an interest in shocking us on these numbers.
Yes.
But also, I mean, it shouldn't be a huge surprise, right?
No, I mean, I think that there have been studies from, I think Consumer Reports had a study last year that did have some pretty, I don't remember what the exact figure was, but they did reveal that there are a sizable number of kids under the age of 13 who are violating Facebook's terms of service, and certainly violating COPPA, by, or putting Facebook, I think, at risk of violating COPPA is perhaps the better way to phrase that, by being on the site. I think that this raises some. I mean, and these statistics, like you said, these statistics do come from a website that promises parents a way to monitor their children online. But I think that this actually, I think that COPPA is one of those rules that we really do need to think about, because a lot of these kids who are on Facebook who are under 13 have done so with their parents' permission. So their parents are helping encourage them lie lie about their age and lie in order to get access to websites. And I think that that's a that certainly demonstrates that the COPPA says it's supposed to protect kids online, and certainly any system that now parents and kids are working together to lie to get around it seems to be a gross failure.
I'm sure there are lots of companies out there who were fined for violating COPPA, which is basically for storing information about those under the age of 13
Mm-hmm.
being stored by a commercial company,
Right.
are probably looking and saying, well, why isn't Facebook being fined?
Facebook says that it does it. I think that again from the Consumer Reports thing, I think they said that they banned something like 10,000 kids a day from Facebook that are under 13.
Yeah, but I think even I'm trying to remember what the high profile case was of the company. The founder actually died in an airplane crash, but they were fined substantially, even though they were making really good
Right.
efforts. The fact was that their servers were storing data on children under 13.
Well, and I think, when we think about a company who has just a really lousy track record of protecting its users' privacy, and I think, Facebook is the poster child for really, for making all sorts of changes about what data gets shared, what data gets shared publicly, what's happening to your data. I think the fact that, again, that COPPA, that parents are willing to sort of help their kids violate the COPPA protections. What does that say about how we're having intelligent conversations about, again, it's back to this question that I brought up earlier about data ownership and data control, because you don't control your Facebook data, and parents are willing to, if parents are willing to have their young children's data sold that way, I think that's that's certainly pretty troubling to me.
My guess is most parents aren't even thinking at that level.
Right.
Okay, so what are we being told about the ways in which the Gates and Lumina Foundation's philanthropy is changing higher ed?
This is a really interesting story. This is a research paper that's going to be presented next week. I think that in the case of the Gates Foundation in particular, I think that it's fairly widely known the ways in which the organization has really tried to reshape K-12, education at the K-12 level, whether it's the small schools or their involvement in Common Core. But this research paper looks at what they've done at the higher ed level, and noting that that the Gates Foundation is definitely making these sort of strategic investments in certain projects. Their latest focus is sort of college readiness, and so how are they supporting programs that are geared towards the students who are sort of struggling in their first year of school, of college, and thinking about how is it that philanthropy at the higher ed level has never really been seen as being very political, and clearly the money that the Gates Foundation and the Lumina Foundation are donating to schools is part of this larger political agenda that these nonprofits are interested in furthering. So it's definitely politicizing higher ed in the way that higher ed hasn't had to think about philanthropy in that way.
For what it's worth, I interviewed Mark Tucker this week on his, I'm going to call it brilliant book called Surpassing Shanghai,
Yeah.
in which he looked at the educational practices of 5 of the top performing PISA-tested countries in the world in a very balanced way, with an understanding that a standardized test can't tell you everything, but makes the phenomenally interesting point that none of our educational reform activities are being done by any of the countries who are seeing what we would acknowledge as successful educational practice. And it's a book I'm not hearing much about, but would give it a 5-star recommendation. Okay, the University of Florida is dismantling its computer and information science department. You don't say much about this in your wrap up, but is this what are the implications of this? And why are they doing it?
Um, it seems to actually be sort of there's actually been surprisingly, we hear these different conversations about the importance of programming, the importance of teaching, sort of having computer and computing literacy become more widespread. Questions about whether or not computer science should be a required, at least one computer science should be a required to graduate. And then at the same time, we're seeing in several universities this move to shutter the CS department, or to take it, to combine it with other departments. And it's hard to know sort of what's actually internal campus politics. In the case of University of Florida, it certainly looks like that's the case. Um, but I think it is, it's again, it's sort of this disconnect between some of the things that we are seeing as potentially valuable skills, valuable knowledge, valuable majors, and then universities not providing the place for those skills to be sort of taught on campus.
Interesting. Shades of the library politics right now.
Yeah.
Okay, so in our sort of our final story of the day, Udacity, the online learning startup coming out of Stanford's massive AI classes, launching, wrapping up the first round of classes, launching new ones, and some interesting plans about final exams.
Yeah, this was sort of one of those stories that I bookmarked to read later in the week, because I actually, I took one of the Udacity courses that just wrapped up, and I thought, well, the Wall Street Journal was sort of profiling yet again Sebastian Thrun and Udacity, and I sort of bookmarked to read it later, thinking, what do they have to say that I don't already know, having spent the last 7 weeks working through the classes. And when I actually when I went to write my roundup and went back and read the story in detail, there's this line or a couple of sentences that are just sort of glossed over in the Wall Street Journal piece that gave me pause, and that's the fact that Udacity is offering the some 5,000 Pearson. It's offering the final exam to be administered in some 5,000 testing centers run by Pearson all over the world, and then through that Pearson testing center, it sounds as though there's some special certification. And now it's hard to tell because Pearson wouldn't comment. It's hard to tell if this is Pearson certification on top of the letter of completion that the Udacity students will already get. But this relationship between Pearson and its its sort of standardized testing machine and Udacity was definitely a troubling one for me.
So when I started holding virtual conferences, the first was the Global Education Conference, we looked at sort of what were the vestiges of physical conferences that practices that were in place that related to the physical nature of the conference that you actually just didn't need in a virtual conference, and what did we learn that was completely different than we expected from holding a virtual conference. And one of the things that we learned was that the whole vetting process for conferences, who gets to speak, is highly counterproductive. A requirement in physical conferences because of limitations on time and space, but in a virtual conference where the users can pick who they want to go listen to,
Mm-hmm.
you actually not only can get rid of a lot of the vetting, but you end up getting a much higher range of offerings at a very high quality level that you don't expect. And I was reminded of how years ago when you would leave the airport, you actually had to hand your baggage tag to somebody who would check it against your physical bag to make sure you weren't stealing someone else's bag, right? And somehow we discovered that we actually didn't need to do that. And this story for me led me to just opening this whole question of, to what degree is assessment even necessary for these kinds of courses? I don't want to open Pandora's box here, but I'm really intrigued by the idea that we're perpetuating practices that may not necessarily need to be perpetuated. And should we be rethinking this in much bigger ways?
That's a really interesting question, and that's one of the things that it's it's really fascinating to watch, to think about the potential, what happens when you take a traditional college class. I mean, in the case of Sebastian Thrun, the AI class that he offered at Stanford, and then you move it online. So what practices do you replicate, and what practices do you leave behind? How does your teaching change, and how does your teaching stay the same? How do you think about, how, as you were saying earlier, how does getting rid of the constraints of having only a certain number of students, how does that change how things operate? And it's fascinating to see what exactly that many of the same things that would happen in a class do still happen in these online classes. And then it's also interesting to see the ways in which things have shifted. So in the case of Udacity, rather than having, say, an hour-long lecture and then you get assigned homework, the video instruction is broken down into sort of 2 to 3 minute videos that are then followed by a quiz. So it's become, the content has become very modular, and then there's immediate chance for students to get feedback on whether or not they grasp, whether do you grasp that 2 minute video through a quiz. But then some of these other practices like homework and the final exam are still in place, which is, considering that there's no grade, there's no grade on your transcript, I should say, and there's no college credit, and that really the demands of having a final grade don't exist. It is fascinating to see what these systems still replicate when they move it online.
I mean, if you participate in a game of some complexity, it's the actual finishing of the game or getting to a certain level that seems to be sort of the moment of personal satisfaction and the ability to move on and feel like you've accomplished something of a certain value. For you, having taken the course, how much do you care about someone else's assessment of what you learned in that course?
For me, very little, but and I think that in some ways that these are some of the differences between people who sort of like the self-motivated learning, right? That's very much I'm interested in CS 101 because I'm interested in CS, which is very different than I have to take this particular course because my job requires it, or I want a job that in which I have a credential that says I know this information. So I think it's part of it is part of it is extrinsic motivation for why people take certain classes.
A great conversation to be continued, I'm sure.
Yes.
Audrey, thanks again. Terrific talking with you. Really
Likewise.
appreciate all of your great work. Have a great week, everybody.